We thank you very much for joining us this morning, and every morning we're live on KTN Home as well for the next 1 hour. On Spice FM in Malindi, 97.7, in Nyeri is 90.9, Nakuru 96.0, Eldoret 96.7, in Kisumu 102.5, and 87.9 in Mombasa. Nairobi is 94.4 CT. We begin this new hour with the proverb of the day.
When brothers fight to the death, a stranger inherits their father's estate.
When brothers fight to the death, a stranger inherits their father's estate.
I like such proverbs, which are so straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, nothing convoluted. You don't have to tax your mind into trying to figure out what on earth they were trying to say.
You hear it, we move on.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
It's direct.
So tell us about this recession and how you see it.
Well, there is, in the lives of human beings, there's always a discipline that tries to explain to you certain aspects of our lives. And when you have a situation where a pandemic has ravaged the entire global economy, then certain terms that have been used by the discipline specialists called economists come into being. And among the words you hear are recession. And you begin to wonder, what on earth does a recession mean? We were talking about booms, and we were talking about the decline in the boom. But when you have a situation where what was normal stops being normal, people lose their jobs, businesses decline, and there's a vicious cycle about this, because people then, one, without jobs, don't have the money to purchase things. So the production levels have to go down because the demand isn't there. And when all these things come together, you then have a situation that has to be explained. And I think the people who are best placed to explain this are people who understand economics and finance. And one such person is Wangari Muikia, who will help us with this discussion in trying to determine whether Kenya is actually in a recession or not.
Okay, but before she comes in, you are saying that you think we're in a recession.
I don't think I know we are in a recession.
Oh, okay.
I know we're in a recession simply because if I look at the tenets or the definitions of recessions as has been given by the experts, the indicators are as follows. 1, jobs are being lost. Economic activities are slowing down significantly. And more people who even had the ability to be able to work are unable to work. And for an economy to grow, these things need to be on the up and up. So, as I mentioned, when you don't have people with incomes, you don't have people who have the capacity and the ability to buy. And if you don't have the capacity to buy, it means you also reduce the circulation of the money. Essentially, economic activity slows down. And when it continuously slows down, and not just slows down at a steady pace, but continues a downward spiral, then you have a situation where, in my mind, it fits a perfect description of what is normally referred to as a recession. Yes.
Do we have that, Ndu? Are you feeling that we have what he's saying?
Well, if you want to look at the definitions of recession, we have a general decline in economic activity. And you can look across board in Kenya, and you can see that actually has happened. I think that this can be defined, or this can be experienced in many different countries in the world at this time, whereby not in terms of people's buying power and ability to spend has been greatly reduced by virtue of the fact that other things have taken place. Enter COVID, for example. Enter the situation with the Kenyan economy before that, when spending was high, debt was high, and generally the economy had taken a hit. Now, when you bring in COVID, you see that certain things have happened which has affected people's ability to then spend, which is one of the major definitions of a recession.
Okay.
That's what it means.
But there's also the other term.
I think what we're looking at is when you think of the word recession, you're waiting for some big trumpet call and some big activity to happen. But you could see that, I think, and maybe as we talk about it, you'll see that at different points that you would see that it would recede. That you could be in a recession for shorter periods of time, for longer periods of time. But I think that once you look at the general decline of spending, you could very well then say that a recession is taking place.
But it's important to apply the word according to the actual usage and definition of the word. For there to be that depression, then the indicator...
Recession. There's a
recession,
difference
yes.
between the two.
For there to be that recession, then we'd have to get into that area where we are looking at the monitoring of the various aspects, which include GDP. Has GDP gotten into a slump for 2 consecutive quarters? And the information that is coming out to indicate that okay, 2 successive quarters, this is what has happened. Is that the case that you're saying?
In Kenya?
Yep.
You don't even need to read into it. The one thing that, say, Kenya KRA tells us frequently is just a clear reduction in the sort of the amount of money that they are able to collect.
But that's not a reduction in economic activity.
Actually, it does indicate,
Well,
because
it's one of the indicators. It's not the one that completely defines the GDP.
no, I'm actually going by what is easy to
If
understand.
we come out and the data from the National Bureau of Statistics and then the other data from the Treasury comes and says, so economy, the GDP is at this point in this quarter, looking at quarter on quarter, this is where we are. Comparing with the previous quarter, this is where we were.
All right.
And the indicators will look at the sectors, the agricultural sector, the finance sector, all the other sectors. And there's then a general drop in activity.
Actually,
and
there's a
reduction
very
in
direct
activity.
correlation, because all the economic activities that lend itself to the aggregation that we call the gross domestic product, GDP, are economic activities. Now, what COVID has done is that even those activities have been reduced. Let's say, for instance, our exports, whether it is flowers, whether it is whatever it is that we do. There has been a reduction because the takers themselves have reduced what it is that they normally take, because they themselves have the same problem as us. So, simply because of that, and I said, take your pick, there is a very direct correlation, and all these enterprises are taxed by KRA based on what it is they produce and the money that they generate. It's a percentage, but the amount is determined by the level and the volumes of business. Now, if it means KRA is collecting a little less compared to before, it means there is less to collect. So clearly, it's a definite indication that economic activities are down, and it's a sum total of these that contribute to what you're calling GDP.
Let's bring in the expert to help us understand this topic. Wangari Muikia is the public finance management specialist. Wangari, good to have you again on the show. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, everyone.
Well, it's good to speak with you again. The last time we spoke was just before the budget, and we were looking at the budget preparations and what we were expecting to come out of the budget. Now here we are, and CT Muga is saying, "Look, guys, we are in a recession." Wangari, are we?
Well, I think what we need to do is first have a description of what a recession is. And if you look in the economic literature, there's no one kind of description of what a recession is, unfortunately. I mean, you would think that by now they would have come up with some sort of standard description, right? But what we term as a recession is generally a dip in economic activity for over about 2 periods. And that's what we are terming as a recession. So if we apply that to what's happening in Kenya, we could then say that we are in a recession, that economic activity, just as CT Muga was saying, has taken a downturn. Now, as you know, the economy is never a static kind of level of activity, right? It always has its ups and downs. So in that sense, recessions always happen. You have peaks and you have troughs. But when, in the sense of what we're talking about, when we use the word recession, people say a recession essentially is when there's a significant downturn in economic activity. Sorry, my internet is not working very well. Apologies, guys.
All right.
When you have a continuous downturn in economic activity, that's when you have a recession. And when you have it for a prolonged period of time, then that's what you call a depression.
Depression, right.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's over time. So CT, is that over time?
You talked about 2 quarters. Since COVID struck, a quarter is 3 months.
Yep.
Count February to October. We've gone beyond 2 quarters.
Right. You're going to
And from the time COVID struck, our economic projections have been on a downward movement. I'm not calling it a spiral. It's just downward movement. Yes. And the downward movement has not decreased. It may have slowed down, but it has not decreased. We are still moving downwards. More people are being losing their jobs. People are earning less. There's all this shifting. Now, we are told that there are some sectors which are doing well, but they represent, again, a dot when you consider. The only thing that one may argue they represent is the amount of money that you find vested in that particular sector. It may be a great deal of money, but it doesn't represent the numbers if you're talking about the population of this country. And you see, the economic activities, for them to make sense for a country, it has to be cumulative. Those at the high end of it, those at the middle, and those at the low. And when you consider that we are a country that has the informal sector as its backbone, literally, then the informal sector have been very hard hit by the coronavirus. Really hard hit. So it means that as far as we are concerned economically, we are limping.
So basically, if we just go by the definition of what you're saying, what you're stating is the obvious. That COVID came, it affected livelihoods, it affected economic activity.
And it continues
All
to
right.
affect.
So then, why then bring up the issue of the recession? What is the impact or implication of a country going into recession?
It's just definition of what is happening, giving it a technical definition and saying these things that are happening, they actually call a recession. That's really as opposed to a depression, which is an extreme form of what we are seeing and for a much longer period.
Right. I think though that it would be important to look at where you are, so that realization of where you are helps you to see the potential danger. Because it's interesting. You remain, if you're talking about recession, which you could be in here, and then 6 months later you're not, and then maybe some weeks later you are, remaining in that period or remaining in that condition for a longer period of time takes you to a place whereby it will be much more difficult to get out of, with all factors taken into consideration. Getting into a period of depression for the economy is actually a very, very dangerous place to be. Especially when you're at a time in the world where global trends, for example, demand robust economic activities from all players, demand you to be in a place whereby you're able to compete, otherwise you're thrown out. And then you see things that are happening with countries like Greece and the like. So it demands of you to be at a particular place health-wise or healthy economically. Now, the recession, I think, would be a pointer to say, hold on, this is actually what is happening. Are there things that you can put in place to make sure that you don't remain in this position for a long period of time? Because then it will put you in a place that will be very difficult to get out of. So whereas it's making a definition or defining the state of things at the moment, I think they're also probably indicators as to where you don't want to be for a prolonged period of time. And to say that there are things that you can actually do as an economy, as a country, to either boost your status or make sure that you don't remain there for long.
You know, if you look at Kenya and you do not look at the rest of the world, because the rest of the world has also been affected by COVID, or perhaps if you look at the rest of the world, some of the bigger economies, perhaps it becomes even clearer and probably more obvious. Like, say, countries that have a big sector in the stock market, you find that the activities in that particular sphere often are a clear indicator of the economic activity and the economic standing of that particular country. Now, throughout the world, that sector has been hit. But the other thing that has happened right across the globe is unemployment. You do not hear of countries anywhere in the world that are increasing to employ people. No, there's a clear decline in employment. And that automatically has an immediate effect on the earnings and also the earnings of the government, who tax these earnings. Right? You also hear of governments coming in with packages to help their citizenry, those who are able to afford it, and those who are bringing what call it stimulus, giving people money to ensure that they actually have means to eke a living. All these activities are not activities that you'd have in a normal setting where people are going about their business normally. When someone requires help, it means they are disabled. That is why they require that particular help. And the disability here is an economic one, which encompasses the financial disability. And that is what this country is going through and has been going through now steadily.
All right.
Yes.
So, did we have a recession before COVID? Wangari is still with us. Wangari, you can answer that.
So, to some extent, that yes, we did, but it wasn't an uncommon one. It was one of those, as I was saying. You have the normal kind of cyclical event of economic growth. But in 2018, our GDP growth was about 6.3%. And in 2019, it went down to about 5.4%. So by our definition, then you would call that a recession. But the economy in 2020 was by and large expected to rebound to about 6% again. But of course, COVID happened, and then we went back into a recession. But if I may point out one thing, when we talk about a recession, you can still have a recession. You can still have economic growth in a recession, and I think that's what is happening in our context in Kenya. Yes, we've gone down from 6.3 down to 5.4, and now it's about estimated about 1% by the big international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. Although the National Treasury and the Central Bank have said our growth is more about 3%, it is lower, but it's still growth. We're not in the negative economic growth part of our economic activity. But like he was saying, it is a recession is something that you actually feel. You hear people losing their jobs, people getting pay cuts, people not being able to pay their loans, people not being able to sustain themselves, people moving to shags because they're not able to live in the expensive urban economies. And all of that is what it feels like to be in a recession. So by all means and by all definitions, what C.T. Muga was saying, yes, a recession is something you actually feel. It's not something that is, is in theory in the books.
Wangari, just explain this to me. In economic terms, what defines growth? What is growth? How do you define it? How do we, if I were to look at it, what do I need to see in order to identify that this is now growth?
Well, the standard definition of growth is the GDP, right? So you have the consumption, you have investment, you have government spending, and then you have net exports. And it's essentially what a country in total, in aggregate, produces, and the growth in that production is what we call economic growth. So if we're doing more business, if we're doing more manufacturing, if we're doing more industry, if we're exporting more than we're importing, all of that in aggregate counts towards our economic growth.
What would be there are obviously indicators that show that there's a recession taking place. Some of the things that you've talked about, when there's a loss of jobs, there are those who complain about them not being able to meet their needs as they normally would. What essentially would be the way that a government would seek to buffer that situation so that it doesn't stay for long, getting the place to depression that you mentioned earlier? There must be things that you can do.
Well, I think we should talk about what's happening in the pandemic today. It's a really unique situation because it's almost a forced recession, right? Everybody closed down their borders. Some of the counties in Kenya, we closed the borders around the counties. But the demand was there, the supply was there. Manufacturing, industry, everything was still going. But we had to put a stop on that. So in economic terms, it's really a unique situation that we're facing. And we need to ask ourselves, how do we continue to uphold the economy even in a situation like this? A country like Kenya, we are quite diversified. We are in different sectors. So we were not as much exposed to the economic hit as many other countries. We were definitely hit on the tourism side on one case, but on the other side, our agricultural sector was booming, and that's what has upheld us, I think, as we go, as our economy continues to grow, even by that 1%. Other sectors like the financial sector was also bolstered, and I think that, again, that's what has propped us up. I was listening to the person earlier talking about real estate and talking about the diaspora. But even in a recession, and in this situation, this particular pandemic, the remittances that were coming, that were used to coming from abroad, they were not coming anymore because in the developing countries, they were much harder hit when it came to the effect of the pandemic. So we don't have the luxury of relying on remittances or diaspora flows anymore. We need to look within. And I think part of the solution, part of what the government was doing, whether they were successful or not, was to really try to push that Build Kenya, Buy Kenya initiative, where we are saying we can't import goods and services from other countries. We need to rely on ourselves to grow. And I think there was an opportunity there. I'm not sure whether we grabbed it with both hands, but I'm hoping that, that will come out in the wash, whether we've been able to uphold our industries.
Some data that came from the central bank, I think around about June, was indicating that there was not a significant drop in the amount of remittances from the diaspora for some reason. And in fact, that actually formed some sort of discussion of, you'd have expected that because of the harsh economic times and the impact of COVID-19 in many of these countries. If you look at, for example, the Middle East, many Kenyans lost their jobs and they got back home, but there was still a significant amount of remittances arriving in the country around that time.
Well, I think that maybe you'd have to think about what that means when people are in a situation where they've been furloughed or they're not, they've lost their jobs. What is behavior of people? And naturally, you find that some people feel that it's safer to send their money home. They also saw that the numbers in the pandemic were not as high in African countries, Kenya included. And so maybe there was some sort of hedging where we're saying, look, if I don't have a job, I've been furloughed, I need to think about the future. Maybe I should invest in coming back home. And so maybe people are also thinking about, creating their nest eggs and not necessarily sending money home to support their families or things like that. Maybe sending money home so that they can start their own kind of little, build their own nest egg so that they come home to be in a more stable situation.
So, Wangari, you said it's possible to have a recession, but at the same time, the economy is still growing. The outlook from the IMF and the World Bank is at a GDP of hitting around 1% or thereabouts this year, from 5.4% in 2019, but the government is still insisting, no, it's got to be above 2%, 2 to 3%. Which one do you believe?
It's really hard to say. There's so many different variables and so many different factors. It's really hard to say whether the IMF is correct or whether the National Treasury or even the central bank is correct. It really feels different for different people in the economy. The people in agriculture are resilient. The people in the financial sector are resilient. But then you look at tourism, and those guys will tell you, yes, growth by 3%, 2%, whatever it is. But if you look at people in tourism, if you look at people in the hotel industry, manufacturing that have had a decline in economic growth, they'll tell you it looks more like the 1%. So it really is, it's hard to tell right now. It's a mixed bag.
Wangari, there's something that concerns me, and that is why I'm sort of like scratching my chin. I mean, we know about the problems that are brought about by recession, but surely, is there any silver lining to recession? Is there anything positive that comes out of a recession?
Well, for some people whose industries usually grow in recessions, they'll tell you that this is their silver lining. Like I said earlier, there are some people who actually benefit from being in a recession. There is always there are always winners and losers. But I think for us, and particularly now, I think there's some insight that we're getting into what the structure of our economy is, where we can hone in our focus and where we can look for into the future. So, for example, we always talk about agriculture, and we're still in the dark ages of agriculture. But actually, agriculture is what held us up. So we need to have a new, renewed look at this sector and say, what can we do to prop this industry up, value addition, but also just really thinking about the bones of our infrastructure. We found out that in a recession or over the pandemic, people still needed tea, people still needed fruits, people were still, the demand for our agricultural products was high. So we need to also look at things like that. We're also now looking at the future and saying, the resilient businesses that have stayed and survived this pandemic, those are the ones that probably we need to be looking at. E-commerce is on a boom now. So maybe we need to think about how can the government support e-commerce instead of taxing it, which is what we were seeing earlier, heavy taxes, but also how can we start to prop it up and take ourselves into the future, kind of leapfrog into the future with this kind of new insight.
And if you look at budgetary allocations over the years, the sectors that have been receiving the bigger chunk of budgetary allocation vis-a-vis those that don't receive such a high chunk. Which ones would you say have then held us and carried us through this period?
Well, like I said, definitely agriculture. Agriculture has been taking a lot. Education also takes a big part of GDP. But as we've seen with education, it's been hit and miss, and actually very largely a miss with us. We talked about putting in the laptops. We talked about all these grandiose ideas that were, slow to start. And you can imagine if we had prepared ourselves earlier, if we had actually implemented the laptop project, we would be having a very different discussion right now. Now we're taking a big hit on human capital development because we've had a whole year of students, quote unquote, learning from home, because some are able to learn from home better and others not because of the resources and the economic levels experienced in the homes. And even having a parent there to teach the child is, it's not a guarantee. So I would say, even as we're putting a lot of money into these sectors, how are we using it? What is the value for money? And how are we thinking about the future in how we're investing in our country?
And what do you see is the way in which this is being done? Because I think it's important. Because then we also have even if it is an image that you then put to the people of the country to understand what exactly is going through. Because the responsibility of then what is being done with what is available is on the government, whichever way we want to look at it. So what, from your point of view, what actually is being done to make a better situation for tomorrow? What is actually being done? How are these resources being used? In what state is the economy right now? What state is it really, really in?
Well, the pandemic has really revealed that the economy could do a lot better. And I say this kind of in broad strokes because it's across the board, right? In agriculture, we're not doing the value addition that we need to be doing. Education is struggling. Healthcare was a big one in this pandemic. If it had hit us in the way the world was saying it would have hit Africa, we would have been a very different space right now. We've talked about the big four projects. If we had a lot of progress in those areas, we might have been in a very different situation. Universal healthcare, agriculture, housing, manufacturing, all of these as part of our vision. If we had put our resources and bolstered this and not seen a lot of these kind of corruption scandals, misuse of financing, I think we would have been in a very different space. But I think the question is also about value for money. Even as we're investing in universal healthcare, even as we're putting money to education, are we getting bang for our buck? And I think that's one of the fundamental questions that the Auditor General and the Controller of Budget often try to help us to see. But even when the audit reports come out, I have to confess, they do outline some of the key challenges that we're having, but there's no redress. So if we say in an audit report that the value for money is low, what is Parliament and government actually bound to do to address these issues that are coming in the audit report? And I think from a public finance perspective, that could be bolstered.
So you say that this lacks in our audit reports. And this is something that should be included, because now you're coming up with a report and then you're not saying then what is it that should be done to enhance the utilization of the money.
Yes, I think the audit report does highlight many of the challenges that we're facing, but the challenge comes into addressing those the things that are coming out in the audit reports. We always say that Kenya is a land of fantastic laws, but the implementation of that law and adherence to the rule of law is where we struggle. And so we have a lot of good parameters in the Public Finance Management Act. We talk about the audit, making sure that the audit is about 1 year, is on time, and it's usually 1 year lag because you have to audit the two previous years. But we were seeing like 2, 3, 4 years lag. And the Public Finance Management Act says you're not supposed to have this serious lag. But, there's no real kind of progress towards this kind of goals. But there has been some work. I have to give credit where credit is due. There has been some work with the Auditor General to try and improve some of these parameters with support from institutions like the World Bank and IMF, etc. We are seeing some changes. But I also have to say, we shouldn't always wait for the development partners to come in and try to prop us up. Surely we can do a lot of these things on our own. Surely we don't need people to crack the whip all the time to get as to where we need to be. We need to build our own kind of strength and resilience when it comes to dealing with the rule of law and dealing with how to take care of and improve the condition of our own country.
Actually, we do need someone to crack the whip, because if you look at our track record, the one thing we seem to do very, very, very well is the very thing you said we should not do. At what point do you think we will be able to gather our wits about us and be able to put the right foot forward and do what we need to do? Because it isn't as though the leadership doesn't know what they ought to do. They do know. Anyway, that was an aside. What I wanted to ask is this. Okay.
I was struggling to figure out what I was going to say about that.
No.
It
was an aside. It was just an aside. Now, what I wanted to ask is, okay, we are in a recession. Is there a way out of it for the individual? How does an individual get out of this recession? Here I am. I'm finding myself in this recession. My pay has been cut. There's a likelihood I would lose my job. There's a likelihood I will be thrown out of my house. I can't pay my mortgage. How do I sort out these problems?
Well, this is one of those things that an individual may not be able to, on their own, get out of this recession. There's going to need to be a lot of government intervention. And there has been some attempts towards that. Whether that has been successful is something I think that we will debate about now and going into the future. So, for example, if you've lost your job, you don't have a roof over your head, definitely the government needs to come in strongly with cash transfer programs now and social protection programs. Now, social protection programs right now deal with small subsets of the economy. Our challenge was how to expand that to kind of the increased number of people that became vulnerable. One of the challenges that we did have in our approach to dealing with the pandemic is that when we closed the borders, we didn't allow people to manage their own incomes and manage their own standards of living by migrating back to shags. So, for example, if I'm not able to live in Nairobi, or I've come in from Kakamega and I'm living in Kibera slums because I had a job and then I lost my job, with the border, I was not able to relocate back to Kakamega so that I can manage my income and also to survive the times. So I think that kind of mixed basket posed a lot of challenge for us. But things like social protection programs, cash transfers programs, but also funds to prop up small businesses, to allow small business to continue to thrive and survive, well, not necessarily thrive, but at least to survive the period, so that when things start to stabilize, they're able to pick up and start to generate income on their own. It can be a challenge even to think about which business are going to survive, which businesses are not going to survive. But for now, that's just a risk we have to take. The government just provides funding for SMEs, and then it will all kind of come out in the wash, I think, at the end of the day.
The taxation regime that the government seems to want to institute, even on some of these small-scale businesses, does it really help us get out of this situation, or does it exacerbate the condition that we actually find ourselves in?
Well, there were some rafts of tax reliefs that the government did give. So, for example, reducing VAT, reducing the PYE. But I always maintain that, the business landscape in Kenya is mostly informal. So many of the businesses were not paying these taxes in the first place. So even as the government did try to put in some work to providing reliefs, for about 80% of the businesses which are informal, this was not felt. They did feel it in some way when it comes to VATs, because some of the supplies and the inputs to their businesses did get those VAT reliefs. But by and large, I think a large swath of the economy, and I'm talking about the informal sector, was not propped up or supported in the way that it could have been. And I think this is a challenge with the informality of the Kenyan economy. It's hard to pinpoint, it's hard to identify who these people are and how to give them resources as a group.
I would like you to repeat that last statement you've made, that they are hard to identify.
They're hard to identify and hard to pinpoint and focus in terms of providing relief.
Yeah, well, you sound like, what you're saying resonates with something I read in a World Bank report. The informal sector is not difficult to identify, if you ask me. They're even not, if the government can come up with a system of taxing them, it means they are not difficult to identify. And they're even able to categorize them into what it is that they do I don't think that the government has not been able to streamline them and actually compartmentalize them and understand what it is they do and how they contribute to the economy. Now, that is my thinking. You may have a contrary thinking, but if my thinking is correct, then helping this particular sector should not be difficult, should it?
Well, I think it is difficult to identify, because to identify the people, you talk about them in general, but if you're going to give specific reliefs to specific businesses, that means these businesses have to self-identify. And the nature of informality is they're trying to operate under the radar. And most informal businesses will not want to come forward and say, I'm an informal business, I need 1, 2, 3 in terms of relief, because when things stabilize, then it's likely that these people then will be included in the tax bracket in the formal sector, and that is not what they want. So it is possible to talk about them in aggregate, but to individualize and say, these are the reliefs that we want to provide to specific informal sector groups, then it becomes difficult to do.
I'm saying that if we're looking at an economy which is depressed, things have seemed to kind of fall apart. It would be the desire, I believe, of the different arms of government and the different agencies tasked with the responsibility of the economy in some areas to put it back together. I know it sounds like kind of like Humpty Dumpty. Now, how do you do this when you already are in such high debt, whereby a huge amount of the budget of money that comes in goes towards paying debt? There's already a debt problem. Then you enter into a pandemic issue as well. Things already were not going well. How do you then revive it? Because I think a lot of times a larger amount of the population sits and thinks, my goodness, we're in dire straits. How are we ever going to get out of this one? With the debt problem, with the pandemic issue, with the saying, okay, inflation dropping. Where do you start from? Putting the building blocks together for people to understand this is essentially what should happen.
Well, over the pandemic and because of the depressed economic activity, we were not able to meet our budget objectives. So even when the tax reliefs were being given, that means that there's going to be lower revenues to the national government. And these are the revenues that actually finance our day-to-day in Kenya, right? The goods and services that we get from government come from the tax revenues that we're paying. So even by doing that, even by providing those reliefs, the government in essence was shooting itself in the leg in order to save the other leg in a sense, right? And knowing that we would not be able to achieve our budget objectives because our revenues were low. And this is where resources from places like the IMF and World Bank now come in. And this is kind of the role of the IMF, role of these kind of international institutions that say, look, we're in dire straits. This is a situation that is not tenable. In order for us to help you to continue to provide some of the essential services, we're going to come and give you some resources to plug the deficit. But then, of course, then there's a challenge because, the COVID fund, we are not actually privy to how this fund was used. We're not sure whether it went into healthcare to increase the number of beds or medical supplies. We're not sure whether it went to SMEs. We're not sure how this money was used, right? So I think that's also a big lacuna for us, where we say, yes, we got all this money from the development partners to prop us up, but did we use it in the right way? And are we feeling it in the economy to say that, thank God we got this money because now we're able to survive? It's really unclear.
Someone has just sent a message saying the corruption is the monster in the room. And even if you look at how we finance our budget and the areas that we focus our attention on when we are allocating money in the budget, those are the ones that have been exposed seriously. Look at education and how much money then it takes in the budget every year and what has happened in the education sector during this COVID-19. Healthcare. So right now, since the last budget, there has been a deliberate increase in the amount of money that is going into towards healthcare, looking about universal health coverage. But even before that, the attention that was going towards healthcare, not only from government but also from development partners and those that have been coming to support our healthcare system in terms of budget, the amount of money that is in the healthcare system over those many years, and yet the healthcare system is left exposed. What does that tell us? I mean, is this not a moment for us to sit back and reflect and say, we are in a recession, we are also finding ourselves facing a pandemic and not being able to know what we are doing, and yet we've been financing and getting all the support to these particular sectors that are now completely exposed.
You know, if you look at, first we start from looking at who deals with healthcare. And if you look at the Constitution, healthcare has been largely devolved. We recently did a study with my firm Expertise Civil Consulting. We did a study on how public finance management either helps or hinders health service delivery. And within that study, we did find that within the county government budgets, health was by far the largest and highly funded sector. So I think there's no kind of doubt that the counties are putting a priority in health. The question comes into the structural processes that go into financing and providing services, goods and services within the healthcare system. What we did find was that the planning processes are not linked to the budget processes, and the budget processes are not linked to the implementation in terms of procurement of goods and services. So that you may be giving 30% of your budget, for example, to health, but if you're not fulfilling the health plans of the health facilities, the ones at the grassroots level to the more county headquarter level health facilities, or if you're not providing the goods and services that they need, if you're not providing them the right personnel, then you find that even with all the money in the world, you still will not get the goods and services that you need, even with all the funding that's coming from the COVID funding. If it's not coming into a system that is structured, that provides goods and services according to need and according to the demands or disease burden within a particular jurisdiction, then you will still have the same outcomes. So it comes in planning and in structuring and understanding how public finance, the finances you receive, actually translates into goods and services on the ground, which we are struggling a lot with in Kenya.
Is the gap the lack of understanding, or is the gap a deliberate lack of implementation or even thinking beyond the planning? So you put in the money in this sector, you ensure that there's a lot of money, and then you can go around the county telling people, you see what we are appropriating a lot of money into the healthcare system, but you're doing the kind of things that you're doing are not really in line with what you had planned to do, so that corruption then is able to thrive. Is this not deliberate?
There is some problems around procurement. I will definitely say that, and there are also questions around corruption. You do see some cases. I'll talk about one case that I saw in one county where they went through a tender process to procure incubators. And they, within what they have is a procurement committee that actually says this is what we need to be able to provide the service that is needed within the county. So, for example, the procurement committee would include a finance person, it would include someone, a medic, and a technician to say these are the types of incubators that we need. But in this particular county, they had not constituted that procurement committee. So whoever came up with the idea or the specifications for the incubators was not the right person, I say, to say it simply. And so what happened is that they put out a tender, they procured incubators, and these incubators ended up burning some of the children, these premature children within the incubator, because it was not of the right specification and it was bought from some, questionable vendors. So then that comes in, so that's what I'm saying. Like, you can go through this whole plan, but if it's taken over by the unscrupulous processes, you spent all this money. You have spent all this money, but now all those incubators had to be removed and taken to some storage because none of them could be used. So that is essentially a lost procurement process and a lost amount of money that could have actually been used for the good of the county. And these are the types of process and challenges that we're seeing at the county level.
Wow. All right. So now, looking at where we are now, I mean, always trying to say, okay, trying to get out of this, looking at the numbers around the world, especially when we're talking in likes of COVID, things are not getting any better at the moment. It looks like wherever we look, things are getting worse. Looking in the Western Hemisphere, on the East, right here where we are, things are getting worse. Are there things that individuals can do? And when you want to look at it from a macro level, when you look at it from the national point of view, or micro individuals, are there things that you can do to make sure that even as the rainy day continues, that your protective gear is still working, even as bleak as it looks at the moment?
Yes, nice. Like you said, now is the time to dig deep. And I think for individuals, it is a tough time, and there's no silver bullet. I have to say there's no kind of quick solution to say this is how we get out of it. But I think in the medium to long term, we need to think about diversifying, even within our own sectors. If you were in the tourism industry, and tourism will come back. It's not like it will die forever. But how do you then future-proof yourself? What have you learned from this experience? How do you then, if you had a biashara on the side, which most Kenyans have, you have your real job and then you have your biashara, what kind of things can you do to diversify your income? And diversify broadly enough that it's not a double whammy. And this can be a hit or miss. I know someone who had diversified, quote unquote, and they had a school and a hotel. But who would have thought that in a pandemic, both would be decimated, right?
Wow.
So, yeah, exactly. So it's really, you can't really say, this is what you should do. But the general principles of diversification and also looking to the future to say, what are we learning? What can we apply to the future? I think would do us good, individually and as a nation.
Always a pleasure. Hey,
too.
that one. Both.
It's both pressure and pleasure.
Today is the day.
Yeah.
Always a pleasure speaking to you, Wangari, every morning as you tune in and also as we have you on the show. Asante sana for joining us today, Wangari. Wangari is a public finance management specialist with expertise global consulting, giving us insights on where we are, as an economy. Wish you a good day, Wangari.
Thank you for having me. Have a good one.
Asante
Cheers.
sana.
Thank you.